Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily LeFevers from the Miami University Alumni Association, and I'm excited to be joined today by Jennie Gilbert, Miami class of 88. She is the Associate Director and Senior Woman Administrator at Miami, and Dr. Susan Lipnickey, the Senior Associate Athletics Director for Compliance and Student Athlete Resource and SW Senior Women Administrator at Xavier University. So welcome, Susan and Jennie. Instead of reading out loud your wonderful bios, I'm going to let each of you introduce yourself and discuss your roles at your current positions at your current schools. But before that, just a quick reminder to our live viewers that you can submit questions throughout the hour by using the Ask a Question button below your video. And with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here with us today, Jennie and Susan. I know you both have busy schedules, so we're excited you were able to join us. Let's start off by discussing your current roles and what you do at your respective schools. So Jennie, do you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. As Emily mentioned, I'm Jennie Gilbert. I am the Associate Athletic Director and Senior Woman Administrator here at Miami. The first thing I want to let the viewers know is the Senior Woman Administrator isn't really a role, it's a title. And it's not just Senior Women's Administrator. I'm the Senior Woman Administrator. I oversee all of our student athletes. I'm just the senior ranking female administrator that sits at the table with the athletic director and the senior staff to ensure that we have an equitable experience for all of our student athletes. So here at Miami specifically, I oversee what we loosely term the student athlete experience. So a lot of things outside of the classroom and outside of their field of play. So I oversee things like our Champions for Life Leadership Academy, career mentoring and networking. We have a Red Hawk Council advisory board of student athletes. I oversee and schedule community service, the student code of conduct, all those kinds of wonderful, fun things. And then I directly oversee 10 of our athletic teams to make sure that our students are having an amazing experience. Our coaches are having an amazing experience, as well as being mentored towards graduating champions. Susan?
Thank you, Jennie. It's really a privilege to be sort of back at Miami, if you will, even though I'm not on campus. I spent the better part of my career at Miami as a faculty member. And really my entree to Xavier took its roots beginning in the late 90s when I had the privilege of being asked to serve as the faculty athletics representative at Miami, the first female to hold that role at Miami, and I'm not sure there's been one since. I was really, really fortunate. The timing couldn't have been better. I had the chance to be on NCAA committees, served on the commissioner search committee, got to meet and engage with incredible student athletes over those 15 years, to work with great coaches, great administrators. So when it came time for Ohio to make some transitions in its teachers' retirement system, I wasn't prepared to retire, so opted to sort of change careers. So I find myself in a position not too much unlike Jennie's at Xavier University, which has been really a very eye-opening and wonderful opportunity for me. I oversee, as Jennie does, all things that are tied directly to the student-athlete experience. I oversee compliance, I oversee sports medicine, I oversee strength and conditioning, I oversee academics, and I also oversee a lot of our programming, as well as created some initiatives to allow us to better serve our student athletes. We began about 6 years ago a cross-campus partnership with groups from all over campus, everything from international students, housing, registrar, financial aid, bursar. We convene every other month and learn a lot about each other, and it has really allowed us to have that open door, open phone, pick up the phone, email, call, whatever. When you have a question, now you know who you're talking to. So our goal, as is the goal at Miami, is to make sure that the student-athlete experience is personally fulfilling, professionally developing, and really provides a safe and healthy climate for students to succeed both in the classroom and in their venue of competition.
Great, thank you. So before we get into it, I think most people have an idea about what Title IX is, but Jennie, could you please give us a brief summary of the law?
Sure. So Title IX was one of the education amendments of 1972. It's a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in federally funded education programs and activities. So this applies to all public and private elementary and secondary schools, school districts, colleges, and universities that receive any form of federal financial assistance. They have to comply with Title IX. So it applies to all educational programs, but it became national headlines because athletics was set as the center stage as one of the programs that are considered educational. And it just was very public center stage. In athletics specifically, a university can comply with Title IX in one of three ways. One is called proportionality, and it just means that the number of opportunities for women in athletics mirrors the general population of the university. So here at Miami, for instance, last year, 51% of the students in the general population were women. So we have to ensure that 51% of our athletes and the opportunities here are for women. So in order to, and obviously that's going to change every year, right? That percentage of enrolled students is going to change. So we have a little bit of leeway with that percentage, but we try to manage, and most universities try to manage that number with roster management. We tell our men's teams, you cannot have any more than X numbers on your roster so that we keep the men's number lower. And then we tell the women, you have to have at least these many. They have a floor number for their roster to make sure that we're going to meet the requirements for proportionality. There's a couple other ways you can meet as well. One is showing growth. You may not be at that proportionality number, but you have shown you have a plan of adding resources and financial support to increase the number for the women. That's a way you can meet Title IX regulations. The third is just by proving that the women just aren't interested in sports enough to add more women's sports to meet the proportion. So in other words, they've tried to offer all these other opportunities, but the women just have not had an interest in those sporting events. Susan, would you add anything to that?
I wouldn't add a whole lot. I think you did a really good job of the overview. I think it's been expanded over time. And now, unfortunately, a lot of people, Title IX has sort of garnered a bad name, I think, for many aspects. But one of the things that it now encompasses too is on campus, not just in athletics, across campuses, all things sexual assault. And so when people hear Title IX, sometimes their heads go to places that have nothing to do with athletics, nothing to do with academic opportunities. So I think the other thing that I would add is that as the world has changed since 1972 and the passing of Title IX legislation, all kinds of things have been added to it. Some have been detracted from it. And so I think one of our jobs, Jennie's job, my job, everyone who has a similar role, is really tracking on where that is going and how the courts continue to interpret what the expectations, requirements, and what meeting those standards really are. So it's a fluid situation for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And Jennie, we'll go to you again with this. You started playing volleyball for Miami in 1985. Talk to us about where you played on campus, how you got to games, where you practiced, and even enrolling in classes as a student athlete. How was it different from the men's sports at that time?
Yeah, so I have, I'm fortunate enough, I've lived a long time. So I was a direct recipient of Title IX and the benefits. But when I came here in 1985, a full 13 years after this federal law, still saw a lot of inequities. And let me start off by saying I am so grateful for the opportunity to have played for Miami, to represent the red and white. I was so glad to have found another group of women who thought like me, that this wasn't just some tomboy phase they were going through, that We really relished that competitive attitude, and we were excited to go to practice every day. But it's really hard to not notice what our friends on the men's teams were getting compared to what we had. So, for instance, many of you that are watching right now might remember Withrow Court. We used to play volleyball in the fall, so we'd report for fall camp in August with no air conditioning, and we had to practice and play all of our competitions in Withrow Court. Not because Millette was being utilized. Millette was only used 5 hours a day for basketball, but we weren't allowed to use Millette Hall because it was the men's basketball arena. It had to be open for the men to come and do their shoot-arounds at all hours of the day. There were a couple of semesters we actually started practice at 10 o'clock at night over in Phillips Hall because intramural basketball had a higher priority than the varsity women's sports. And I've mentioned this before on another webinar that it was really hard to watch our friends on the football and baseball teams get on charter buses to go to their competitions while we as student athletes literally drove the station wagons and vans because we only had one head coach and she couldn't drive all of the vehicles to get us places. So we were driving back and forth. It was difficult. We did not have priority registration, but football and basketball did. They were allowed to sign up for classes in advance of all the other students on campus. We just had to hope and pray that there were seats available for the classes we needed that didn't conflict with practice. So yeah, it's a little bit different. And again, I'm not complaining. I am so grateful for the opportunity, but it was a little bit different for the men's teams. How many years ago? 40 years ago now.
And talk to us a little bit about, I know we've talked before about when you received your varsity letter, even though you played a 4-year sport at Miami, when did you finally receive that letter?
So back in the day, all the men's team got these beautiful varsity jackets, red jacket, white leather sleeves. It had an M on the pocket, big letter M on the pocket. The women got a windbreaker. It didn't have a letter. We never received a letter M that like all the men got and could wear proudly on campus. So when we celebrated the bicentennial in 2009 as an institution, President Hodge reached out and challenged all of us to come up with meaningful events to bring alums back. And so the athletic department invited every female student athlete prior to 1990, because 1990 was when they started awarding the exact same letter jacket to the women. We invited them all to come back for a luncheon and celebration, and we gave them their letter in a plaque so that they could get their actual letter for competing and representing the red and white. So yes, I was a very proud recipient, very excited to finally get my letter in 2009. And I think it was a really meaningful event to feel validated at that point. It was a long time in coming, but I know the women that attended were extremely grateful for that opportunity to get their letter.
Thanks, Jenny. So Susan, we know that you're at Xavier now, but when you were at Miami, you served as the faculty athletic representative. So what was the purpose of this role in the NCAA and at Miami and in the MAC conference?
Sure. So the NCAA requires all NCAA member schools to have a faculty athletics representative. That person is appointed actually by the president, external to athletics, with the idea that somebody on campus has an arm's length relationship with athletics, not to keep their eye on athletics, but to really have their fingers on the pulse of what's happening. As you know, as the NCAA has expanded and things have gotten more competitive, more opportunities for student athletes, unfortunately, there's been an escalation in people trying to utilize some of those opportunities in ways that probably don't match exactly the intent of the bylaws. So it's really a way for the university to sort of have somebody, a faculty member, not necessarily an administrator, a faculty member who actually has connections with undergraduate students to know the pulse and what's happening. And I was very fortunate. I had a number of student athletes in my class. Also had the flexibility in teaching to be able to go to practices, be at every home game. And so you get to hear things. And I think it's a really valuable position on campus. I will say that there are some schools who feel strongly that their faculty athletic representative is a faculty member, for example, in the law school, because they think that's very helpful in compliance. I tend to disagree. I think that the true faculty athletic reps who really can do their job are those that have connections with undergraduate students and the undergraduate experience overall for the non-student athlete as it compares to the student athlete. I think you really have to have context about what it means to be an undergraduate student, all the expectations, all the courses, the number of courses, progress to degree, how many hours you have to take, because none of that applies to a law school, a professional school, or even a graduate degree. The Mid-American Conference, I will say, even today, is exemplary in its utilization of the faculty athletic representatives. At the annual meetings, and Jennie knows this because I sat beside Jennie and the athletic director, the faculty athletic representatives are at the table for all conference meetings, and that doesn't happen at every conference. The other thing, if I can put in a plug for the Mid-American Conference that I think is really, really remarkable, is they are now, I think, the only conference left in the United States that actually has its own compliance group, and they self-police, and it, having served on that committee, having chaired that committee, it is a real learning opportunity because they deal with all levels of infractions, and you learn so much, and you learn like real life specific examples that you can take back to your community and educate your coaches, educate your student athletes, educate your staff. And as I talked about a little earlier, educate those around campus. Like, here's a violation that was actually committed by financial aid. Athletics had nothing to do with it. So how do that helps us then inform our people across campus. So I think, again, the faculty athletics representative serves a multitude of functions, but I think, and there are designated seats at the tables of certain committees at the NCAA, because the voice of the faculty is a very different voice than a coach or an athletic administrator. So I will say that there are days at Xavier when I really have a hard time taking off my faculty hat, which is, I think, frustrating for some people on both sides of the fence.
Susan, while we're talking to you, I know that you're at Xavier now, but when you were, let me go to the next question. So Susan, well, Title IX has made great strides for women. You have a unique perspective. So will you talk to us and share some insights about the negative effects of its passing, in your opinion?
Sure. And I will say, I will start this with saying, certainly without Title IX, probably Jennie or I, and maybe even you, Emily, wouldn't be sitting in the seats we're sitting in. So I want to make it very clear that we are all very grateful for Title IX and the message it has sent and the opportunities it has created for women. I think, as with any legislation, there are always unintended consequences. And one of the things that we saw as an unintended consequence of Title IX was really an increase in opportunities for men, male coaches, male administrators, because back in the day in 1972, when Title IX was passed, the NCAA was a male-only organization. The women had their own athletic organizations, AIAW, and then every state had its own Ohio AIW, and you competed. There were no divisions. So like if you were at Ohio, Miami was playing Ohio State. And so, eventually we found our way to the NCAA, and I think we sold ourselves a little short and could have learned some lessons, but that's a story in the past. But what I will say is that when we had, but in the early stages of Title IX and pre-Title IX, women were coaching, women were doing the administration of their programs. women were athletic trainers and coaches and academic advisors, doing lots of different things. And the men were, quite frankly, much further along in the development of coaches and athletic administrators. And so when Title IX appeared and it looked like women's coaches were going to be paid as the same as the men's coaches, why it just opened up opportunities for men who were coming in, quite frankly, with more robust resumes. And so if you put a male who's taken his team to a national tournament because he was playing in the same divisions and the same level of expectations and the same level of resources against a woman who was playing in the state tournament because it was a state tournament, we didn't have divisions, we didn't do things the same as the men became much more attractive to many administrators who wanted to win. And so here we have, if you go back to the NCAA data, it's really quite depressing in the terms of the demise of the number of female head coaches, particularly in very prominent sports. And I feel badly, I don't want to just blame Title IX because there are a whole lot of things happening in society. I mean, today there are so many more opportunities outside of athletics for women than there were prior to the passage of Title IX. So you can't single-handedly credit or blame Title IX, but I do think it has had a tremendous impact in athletics. And the other thing that I will say is that as you look around the room where there are female head coaches and they have 2 or 3 assistants, often the majority of those are men. So for every female head coach, you're now preparing 2 to 3 male head coaches. So I think we're not helping grow the professions for the women. And some of that's on us. Some of that's on people like Jennie, like me, when we hire a coach, how forceful and I am saying, look, and you can't do that because that's not fair either. You should be going after the best candidate, right? But how do we promote opportunities for women to get them to have the same experiences and opportunities that people like Jennie's had, I've had, and others? We are growing very slowly. Athletic administrators, ADs, not just senior woman administrator, associate ADs. But that's taking time. But again, I think we have to create opportunities at the ground level and look at people to grow. I mean, Jennie and I both share a colleague in Kiana Smith, who is probably one of the first women that I know that was really a guru in the world of operations and facilities. And I'm telling you, she knew her stuff, but I sat in meetings with her where it was an uphill battle. And I contend that if she had been a man in that same role, she would have gotten exactly what she wanted. Now, she eventually got her way because she was persuasive. She knew what she was talking about. She had the data. But again, it's just an example of how hard do you want to have to fight and how long do you want to have to fight to get that credibility. So I will say, in short, we can't totally blame Title IX for where we are today, but I do think it has opened as many doors sometimes for men as it has for women.
I like the unintended consequences instead of, what did I say? Instead of negative effects. I think unintended consequences is a much nicer way.
Roget's thesaurus is a wonderful tool.
So either one of you can answer this. So is there a simple recipe for schools for following Title IX compliance, or is it much more difficult than here's the law, here's what you need to do? And I know you both have.
Well, it is that simple. It really is that simple.
But I'm sure there's more work that goes into it than
significantly more work that goes into that. But here's the whole piece. Like back in 1972, when this law was enacted, there wasn't any teeth behind it. And there still really isn't a whole lot of teeth behind it for institutions that are not in compliance. In fact, I have heard, I spent 15 years coaching Division I volleyball in a number of different institutions. And I heard from athletic directors who flat out told me, I'm not going to work hard to be in compliance with Title IX until somebody files a suit and makes me change it. Because right now it's working fine for me. right? But it is a simple law, especially when you have 3 ways of meeting compliance with Title IX. With proportionality, it's just a numbers game. So you make sure your numbers work. We do that. That's how we work compliance here at Miami with Title IX, is that we make sure that our coaches, our male coaches, cannot bring in a whole bunch of extra men on their roster, because that's going to screw up our proportionality numbers. The women, you have to have a certain threshold. You cannot drop below this number in order for us to meet the proportionality. For me, when I talk with other schools, when we have conversations about where issues have come up in compliance with Title IX, it usually has to do with what the Office of Civil Rights terms the laundry list. It's a number of different areas that should be equitable for both the male and the female athletes. Things like the equipment and supplies, right? I can never spend as much money on equipment for my soccer team that I do for my men's football team. But the equipment itself that's provided should be equitable. So if I'm providing football with top of the line, custom made Adidas jerseys and pants, as well as top of the line safety equipment with their helmets, their pads, their cleats, then the women's teams should also be receiving custom made jerseys by Adidas, top of the line shin guards and cleats, the top of the line equipment. That's where the comparison needs to be. It won't be equal, but it should be equitable. And the other thing that they talk about in this laundry list is making sure that the scheduling of practice times and games is equitable. My men's basketball team should not have priority over women's basketball, but we should be collaborating with fantastic opportunities for both teams for practice and games as the premier event. Travel and per diem expenses. If my men's teams are traveling and staying in Hilton's, then our women's teams better be staying in Hilton's and not at Motel 6. Same thing with our food allowances. They should be able to eat at similar restaurants with similar nutritional opportunities. What else is on that laundry list, Susan? Academic services and tutoring is on that list.
Health services, medical support,
Health
all
services. That. Hiring and competition and competence level of coaches. If I am hiring a male coach for a male team that meets a threshold of experience, I should be hiring someone of that similar experience level for my women's teams. Do I have to hire a woman for a women's team? No. Conversely, I don't have to hire a male for a men's team either. Case in point, we have Holly Bonowit-Crone here, coaches the men's swim team. It's the quality of the coaching that's that benchmark. Facilities, that's another one, has to be similar. If we have amazing locker rooms for our men's teams, then the women's should measure up to something equitable. So yeah, when you ask, is the rule simple? Yeah, the rule's really simple. Where schools have to really be engaged and be mindful is making sure all those laundry list things match up across the board.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw in a little different wrinkle into that. And I totally agree. On paper, it looks really simple. If you have 50% of your student population is women and 50% is men, then 50% of your student athletes have to be women and 50% have to be men. In 1972, when Title IX was passed, the majority of students in college were men. And so, you look back in those days and we have really begun to shift so that the majority of those individuals occupying seats in colleges and universities across the country right now are females. Then you add to that, and we experienced this at Xavier. This is a firsthand experience. We are humming along, doing just fine, trying to meet the Title IX requirements, and our nursing program exploded. And try as Xavier and other nursing programs across the country might try, it still continues to attract extraordinarily larger numbers of women than men. So when your nursing program all of a sudden is exploding and really impacting, because we're a much smaller school population, undergraduate population wise, than Miami, and it's really only the undergraduate population that Title IX cares about. When you have 4,100, 4,200 undergraduates, a nursing program that's increasing by even 300 to 500 a year is a significant number. And so we had to be really, really mindful. And actually, this is our first year of offering women's lacrosse, which was an attempt to begin to counterbalance that change in the demographics of our undergraduate population. So it sounds real easy until what you don't realize, decisions you make on the other side of campus can quickly turn and make your job a very different experience. I look at a school like Purdue, 35,000, 40,000 undergraduate students, but very, very strong engineering and science. They still to this day proportionally have more males than females. They are the exception. I look at a school like Ohio State that offers every sport I think that NCAA Division I offers, and they still can't actually, if they did it right by not doing some magic with roster management, couldn't meet Title IX. When you're offering every opportunity that's available within NCAA Division I and still can't meet Title IX, there ought to be a little give and take. So it looks really simple. Like, I'm not a baker, I'm not a cook, but I know when I make a recipe and I follow it, it should come out, but it never seems to come out exactly the same way. And I would say the same thing is true with Title IX.
I like that analogy. That's pretty good. I'm going to have to remember that one. I'm going to steal it.
So to both of you then, and you may have answered this in this last question, but just to kind of condense it a little, where do you think
shoes and knee pads?
Whoop.
Oh,
I have no idea what's going on. I
grateful to Miami
apologize.
for the opportunity.
Hang on just a minute. Let me
that's okay. I'll mute you, Jenny. There we go. So Susan, if you want to start, where do you think that schools across the country can make improvements to ensure that they're investing in women in sports equitably?
I would say from my experience, the schools that I know, and I certainly don't know every school, all have the best intentions. I don't think it's that people don't want to make it happen. I don't think it's that people are not trying. I think there are so many often conflicting, I don't even know what the right word is, but conflicting influences in terms of budget and where your budget is cut. And let's just say, your Miami, Ohio State, somebody who offers top football, and you're getting an offer to go to participate in some tournament or some bowl game or something. There's money coming in, and how do you manage it? I think it's just always trying to be mindful of doing the right thing. And we're in the midst right now of a women's basketball search. We are looking for a new head coach for women's basketball. And we are trying to be mindful of opportunities for everyone, making sure that we are scouring the landscape regardless of age, gender, race, whatever, and making sure that we are looking at who this person is and what they can bring to our student athletes. And then, in my opinion, the real work begins. How do we help that head coach put together a staff that does exactly the same thing? But then it's also not just the coaching staff. Who do you select as the athletic trainer, as the strength and conditioning coach? Who's your dietitian? And again, talk about a field that's predominantly women. Trying to find a male dietitian is extremely difficult. So I think it's just always having that in the back of your mind. And I appreciate the Title IX's attempt to do a checklist. But from where I sit, it is always about the global experience. What are we as a department offering in terms of equity, in terms of diversity, in terms of inclusion, in terms of belonging? Because just having the numbers match up doesn't necessarily mean that we are meeting the spirit of Title IX, which is about opportunities and opportunities that actually are meaningful opportunities, not just to say we have a female in this position. That's not about it. It's about the quality of the person and what they're doing and showing. And are they motivating and mentors for upcoming females and women and men of color? I mean, it is the bigger picture. And so checklist things make me a little uneasy, because I think when you get down in the weeds and you start worrying about checklists, you are really missing the intent and the potential benefits of whatever the legislation is.
Jenny, did you have anything to add to that? Or
I think Susan was so succinct.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Me too. So I know from talking to you, Jenny, that many of our student athletes, but also many of our female student athletes, don't even know what Title IX is. Like you said, a lot of times you kind of think of it as like reporting a sexual assault or something on campus.
Mm-hmm.
So how are we teaching our student athletes, but also our students in general, really, but our female student athletes, the importance of the passing of this law?
Right. I brought this up, and this actually came up because I'm teaching this semester SLAM 212, which is an introductory class to sport management. And when I asked them, my class, and they're mostly sophomores, a couple freshmen in there, tell me what you know about Title IX. All they knew was how to report sexual assault. That's all they knew. They had no idea that in their mother's lifetime, because that's my age, I'm older than most of their moms at this point, that there were absolutely discrimination against women and a reduction in opportunities, even in school. Like, they didn't realize that, chem labs, it was okay for chem labs to only be open for the male students, and that the women only had access to the lab at 9 o'clock at night. And it was totally permissible at that time. And so from an athletic perspective, they had no idea that such a thing even existed, mostly because they watched their friends of the other gender practicing in the same gym they practiced in elementary school or in high school. So the part of the piece we mentioned earlier, Susan and I are so grateful for Title IX because it created opportunities for women that didn't exist earlier. And so a number of these young men and women are growing up and not seeing any of that discrimination. The hard part is, in my estimation, because if they don't know that history, then they don't work diligently and intentionally to prevent us from reverting back. And that's kind of where Susan mentioned earlier, we need to be more forward thinking to create ways to mentor more women in staying in the professions, and staying in the athletic career fields as athletic trainers, as broadcasters, as administrators, as coaches. And so making sure that our students and our student athletes understand how important it is to stay in these professions, and to reach out to those of us in the profession that we can help mentor. We can help create some of those opportunities for them, rather than they either getting frustrated and deciding it's too hard, or just helping them find their niche where they're happiest in staying in sport. Susan, what else can you add to that?
I think it's really, really hard because, as you said, most of the students today look across the aisle at whether it's males or females, and think that things look very similar for them, and forget that it took a long time for us to get here. And I agree with you. I worry about us, as I talked about, like coaches, and just sort of losing ground. And we're going to wake up one day and realize we've lost. We're back where we started in 1972. I will say that the other benefit of Title IX is it gave opportunities for people who are somewhat like just inclined to be outraged by injustice, at least support to say you're wrong in not hiring. You have two equal people. In fact, the woman is more qualified, but you hired the male. Like you've got at least some backing, and knowing that you have that backing, I think, is important. But honestly, I think educating students now in college is really too late. We should be talking about this in elementary and junior high and high school, because honestly, when I'm looking at a school, like I want to know, if I go to a school, am I going to have equal access to certain classes, to certain clubs, organizations, like, and it's beyond sport and thinking about when I get out and I get a job and I'm competing for a job and I see that somebody who I don't believe to be as qualified as I am doesn't get the job, or gets the job and is making more money than I'm making, which is very typical. I think it's ironic, actually, if I can just interject something that has nothing really to do with Title IX talk today. But I think yesterday was National Equal Pay Day. Isn't that the day where women like actually are making like what finally can get to where the men are? Like it takes us 3.5 months or 2.5 months to really make what men are making. But anyway, be that as it may, I think it does, again, go to the point that even if on the surface it looks like things are well, Jennie and I both have upper administration titles, but, are we making the same amount of money that the person who might be a male sitting in a similar seat is making? And, you're at a public institution and you can access that information. I'm at a private institution and it's a little different. So I do think, though, that there are a lot of ways to help guide people and talk about, interviewing and how you can do that, and just being mindful that everybody should be perceived as an equal candidate. And then what are you looking for? The attributes, not the gender, not the race, not the age, not any of the demographics. It should be about the who you are and what you bring to the table. And I think sometimes people can't quite do that.
Thank you both. Those were great answers. So to wrap up our conversation and before we head into our live questions, can each of you comment on how we can continue to encourage women and our female students and student athletes to stay in the world of college athletics and athletics in general?
You want to start, Susan?
Sure. I think athletics is a really different world. It isn't an 8 to 5 Monday through Friday job. It's like surgery. And I was thinking about this question actually on my drive home last night, because this is, I think, the toughest question we have is, how do we keep women? And so I think this, and I'm going to take this on for me, because I don't do a very good job. And that is, I'm going to start talking to people in the medical field, because how do they convince women to be surgeons? How do they convince women to be anesthetists? Like that require you to be like sort of on call all the time, and still you can balance family. You can do like what they're doing some things right that I don't think we are, at least from the outside. Maybe from the inside, I will get in and find out that they're not. But I do think there are some other areas in our lives where the expectations are very similar. It doesn't have every day isn't the same. Some days you might have to work 12 hours, but the next day, you might really only have to be at something for 3 hours. And how do we get people to know and understand that rhythm and appreciate that, and maximize time when they don't have to be at work, and maximize their work life when they are at work, and think about that. And I seriously was thinking, I need to talk to people like that are directors of medical schools and hospitals. Like, how are you retraining? How are you, can't even speak today. How are you retaining females in high demand, high stress, very uneven schedule positions? Because I think we could learn something from that. But that's an
interesting perspective. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. They are able to even increase the numbers of med school applications on the female side. I think as we talk through this a little bit, when they're college athletes and it's in this stage of adult development, it's all about me, right? It's all about how do I fit into this model? What do I want? What am I going to pursue? What are my passions? And I think if we start the conversations about having them stay in a career field in athletics, if we can help them understand the impact they will be making, that just like others have made on them and who they are from their past. And that didn't come out near as articulate as it felt in my brain, but but less extrinsic thought process. But how can I make a difference moving forward based on my passion that I have had as a student athlete for my sport? How can I use that passion, because I'm not competing anymore, to make an impact on those coming behind me? That may be helping that fuel that same fire and passion to keep them involved, even if it's coaching a little league team as a young mom, even if it's going into broadcasting as opposed to being a coach where you're involved 24/7, but trying to integrate their work and their life, not work. There's no such thing as work-life balance in athletics. Just like there isn't in the medical field either. There's no work-life balance. It's work-life integration. And I think if they get a chance to see more examples of athletic departments making these work, that our current student athletes and women students can see that that's a viable option. I know I'm going to be overgeneralizing, but most women want to be the nurturers growing and raising families. Men are a little more okay with and actually kind of enjoy escaping the kids and going to work. And so I think as administrators, if we can help find ways and show ways that young mothers can integrate their work-life balance, they can still be the nurturers and have a career in college athletics. I think that's an important piece, because right now they don't see it very often. They don't see very often the really successful young moms. Pat Summitt was one that was fantastic, but she was one of those few that was a coach at the University of Tennessee. She made enough money. She hired a nanny that traveled with her everywhere. Most of us can't afford to pay our coaches enough to have a nanny. So trying to help find other ways and creative ways to help them integrate, I think, is important.
Great. Thank you both. So we'll head into the live questions, and this first one is for you, Susan. So how does an increased social awareness and understanding of gender identity impact Title IX?
I think that's a really good question. I think that as I said earlier in this, like the world of Title IX changes every single day. And I think we have to be looking to the broader world around us and learn lessons from those of us. First of all, we have to have an awareness. We have to be mindful of awareness, and we have to be able to meet our student athletes where they are. And I think while Title IX is important, it's all about the people first. And we have to make sure that we know and understand who our student athletes are, what their needs are, what the resources available to them are, and how then we, as administrators, as coaches, as athletic trainers, as strength and conditioning coaches, academic support, can help those individuals meet their goals and be an environment that is supportive and non-judgmental and allows them to continue to practice and compete.
Thank you. And then to both of you, more away from Title IX, but just your jobs in general, from where does your passion in athletics come from? And either one of you can start.
For me, I cannot remember a time when I wasn't competitive. Like my dad, I guess I was the male athlete my dad never had. I was the son he could teach how to play basketball and baseball, and until my brother came along. And then it was the two of us playing with dad, playing pickle, all of that fun stuff. But my dad knew how to push my buttons. I mean, my dad would always just say, well, I bet you can't shoot 3 free throws in a row, or I bet you can't do X. He was always the one fueling that fire to be competitive and prove people wrong. And so, but that sense of confidence in my own athletic skill set was the passion to continue in athletics. And I realized how important that was to my own self-esteem and my own sense of self-confidence in everything else I did, that I realized this could be something really impactful that I can do for other women who are in a similar situation. They love to be challenged. They love their sport. So that's when I went into coaching, and then now in administration, trying to provide those same opportunities and make things happen for those women, because I know their prowess on their athletic field directly feeds into their self-confidence for whatever career field they're going to pursue after college.
I have no idea. Neither of my parents were athletic, but both my sister and brother, along with myself, participated in high school sports. I've always viewed athletics as an extension of education. My best coaches were really good educators. Even our athletic trainers were good educators. They were teaching you about the why and the how. Most of you, I don't even know who's on this podcast, but you don't know me, and I'm an extremely, unfortunately, competitive person. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. And so for me, I think athletics was an outlet for that competitiveness, because Jennie claims to be old, but I'm older. And, there weren't a lot of competitive outlets growing up. And so having sports was probably it for me. And then wanting to give back to those opportunities, and quite frankly, a little envious of what opportunities were becoming available, and to be part of creating and maintaining those opportunities and growing those opportunities for women, and helping to make those be done in the right way for the right reasons. So I'd say that's what has put me where I am.
Great. And one of our live viewers asked, do you know of any women coaching a men's sport in college athletics? I know the women, or no, actually I don't. So do you know of any?
Well, right here at Miami, we have Holly Bonawit-Crone is the head coach for our men's swim and dive team. And she's the only Mid-American Conference coach in any sport as a woman to coach a men's team to a championship title. And she's done it 3 years in a row. So that's pretty exciting. That's happening right here at Miami.
Oh, yeah. And I just talked to Holly last month, so she should be on the top of my mind.
Yeah.
Susan, do you know of any?
Off the top of my head, I don't, but I actually, when I first got to Xavier, the head men's golf coach at DePaul was a woman. They didn't have women's golf. She'd always coached the men's team, and she retired, and they now have a male coach, but she was, and they did well. She was quite successful.
Great. Thank you.
I think it goes back to what Susan, sorry.
I said she was a woman ahead of her time.
Yeah. Well, and I think it goes back to what you mentioned earlier, Susan, is the fact that she had that educational mindset. I think those make the best coaches regardless of gender.
I agree. Coaching is teaching.
Okay. And you've answered so many great questions today. So we'll wrap it up after this last question. In the last 10 years, what has been the biggest change that you've seen with Title IX? Jennie, do you want to start?
No.
Susan, do you want to start?
In the last 10 years, what's the biggest change?
Yeah, and it could just be in general, what's the biggest change you've seen? And if you don't want to answer that question, we have one more. We could answer of
I would say this is just my opinion. I think that there hasn't been a big change in Title IX. And I think that's a little bit of a disappointment. But I don't think there's been a lot of change in Title IX. I think people are mindful. I think the litigation has sort of fallen off about Title IX and equality for women. I don't know that there's been a big shift except in the section of Title IX that deals with sexual assault.
That's kind of why I didn't want to go first, because I couldn't think of anything right off the top of my head that has been a big difference. The schools that do things the right way for the right reasons, they're there. But there haven't been a whole lot of Office of Civil Rights lawsuits that have come up. There haven't been many. And that's usually a wake-up call for a lot of people when they hear a national case going down. There haven't been a whole lot of changes.
Great. Thank you both. So thank you for your time today. It was truly a pleasure to talk to the both of you. And thank you to all of you that tuned in. So just a reminder that you can check out all of our upcoming webinars. They're all free on alumlc.org/MiamiOH. This webinar was recorded, and will live on our webinar site. So if you're interested in sharing it with a friend, please feel free to do that. So thank you again, Jennie and Susan. Again, we appreciate your time. And to the rest of you, have a great rest of your day and love and honor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.